Please, I can't breathe properly. Something's wrong with my chest. You need to take a seat and wait like everyone else. Fill out these forms first. Diana Whitmore pressed her palm against her sternum, the crushing sensation spreading from her chest down her left arm like liquid fire. The fluorescent lights of Mercy General's emergency room buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across her dark skin as she leaned against the reception desk, trying to steady herself. "I think I'm having a heart attack," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the busy ER. "Please, I just need someone to." Nurse Linda Nakamura didn't look up from her computer screen. 23 years in emergency medicine had taught her to spot the real emergencies from the attention seekers, and this well-dressed woman in her expensive coat didn't fit the profile of someone having a genuine cardiac event. Too young, too put together, probably just anxiety or heartburn. Heart attack. Rebecca's tone carried just enough skepticism to make Diana's cheeks burn with shame. "At your age? Unlikely. Besides, I can see you walked in here just fine. Real heart attack patients come in on stretchers." The words hit Diana like physical blows. She'd felt this dismissal before, in boardrooms, in grocery stores, in places where her presence was tolerated but not welcomed. But never when her life might be hanging in the balance. "I'm a physician myself," Diana managed, though the crushing weight in her chest made each word a struggle. "I know what this feels like, and I'm telling you something is seriously wrong." Linda finally looked up, her eyes scanning Diana with the kind of practiced assessment that missed nothing and revealed everything about her assumptions. Designer handbag, pearl earrings, confident posture despite the apparent distress. Another entitled professional who thought her credentials meant she could skip the line. "Even more reason you should know better than to self-diagnose," Linda said, sliding a clipboard across the desk. "Insurance information, emergency contact, medical history. Standard procedure for everyone." Diana's vision blurred at the edges. The pain wasn't subsiding, it was intensifying, radiating now into her jaw and making her stomach lurch with nausea. She fumbled for her phone with trembling fingers, needing to call Eric, needing someone who would believe her. But the simple act of reaching into her purse sent another wave of agony through her chest. "I can't," she gasped, the clipboard clattering to the floor as she doubled over. "Please, just let me see a doctor. Something is really wrong." "I need you to calm down." Rebecca's voice had taken on that particular tone healthcare workers used when they'd decided a patient was being dramatic. Panic attacks can feel very much like heart attacks. The best thing you can do is sit down, fill out the paperwork, and wait your turn. The triage nurse will assess you when she's available. Diana looked around the waiting room, half empty, with only an elderly man reading a magazine and a teenager with what appeared to be a minor cut on his hand. She wasn't asking to jump ahead of critical cases. She was asking for help. "How long is the wait?" she asked, though speaking was becoming increasingly difficult. "Could be a while. We're short-staffed tonight, and the doctor's dealing with a real emergency right now." A real emergency. The phrase echoed in Diana's mind as she stumbled toward the seating area, her legs unsteady beneath her. She'd spent 15 years as a cardiologist, had seen hundreds of patients with the exact symptoms she was experiencing right now, had saved countless lives by recognizing the signs that others missed. But here, in this moment, her medical expertise meant nothing against the wall of assumptions that Linda had built around her. She managed to lower herself into a plastic chair, the institutional furniture cold against her back through her coat. The pain was constant now, a vice around her heart that seemed to tighten with each breath. Her phone felt impossibly heavy in her hands as she tried to dial Eric's number, but her fingers wouldn't cooperate. "Hey, my friend, hope you're doing well. Drop a comment and let me know how you're feeling about this story so far and where you're watching from. Some stories are too close to my heart to share on YouTube. I send those, along with little life lessons and surprises, to my email circle. If you'd like to be part of it, you can join with the link in the description." The automatic doors whooshed open, admitting a gust of cold October air and a paramedic team wheeling in an unconscious patient. Linda sprang into action immediately, her entire demeanor transforming as she coordinated with the EMTs, her competence and compassion suddenly on full display. Diana watched through pain-clouded eyes as the woman who had dismissed her now fought to save another life with skill and dedication. That's when the crushing realization hit her harder than the physical pain. Linda wasn't evil. She wasn't a monster. She was a skilled nurse who had simply looked at Diana and seen, what? A threat. A fraud. An interruption to her real work. Diana's phone finally connected to Eric's number, but as his voicemail picked up, She felt consciousness slipping away from her like water through her fingers. The last thing she remembered was the sound of her own voice, weak and desperate, leaving a message that might be the last words her husband ever heard from her. Eli, I'm at Mercy General. Something's wrong with my heart. They won't listen. The phone clattered to the floor as Diana's world went black. Linda Nakamura glanced up from her computer 20 minutes later, noticing that the well-dressed woman was no longer in her chair. Probably got tired of waiting and left, she thought with mild irritation. These entitled types never had the patience for proper protocol. It wasn't until she heard the commotion outside, shouting voices, running footsteps, someone screaming for help, that she realized Diana Whitmore hadn't left at all. She had collapsed in the parking lot, her body seizing as her heart fought a battle it was rapidly losing. And in that moment, as Linda Nakamura ran toward the door to help save the woman she had turned away, she had no idea that the black SUV pulling into the emergency bay carried the one person who had the power to change everything, not just for her, but for the entire hospital system. Dr. Eric Monroe stepped out of his vehicle and saw his wife dying on the cold asphalt, and in that instant, the careful balance of power, prejudice, and presumption that governed Mercy General Hospital began to crumble. The woman he loved more than life itself was fighting for breath, and the people who should have saved her had let their biases blind them to her humanity. What happened next would force everyone, from the newest intern to the board of directors, to confront a truth that had been hiding in plain sight. That the color of Diana's skin had been the only diagnosis that mattered from the moment she walked through those doors. And Dr. Eric Monroe, one of the most powerful men in the regional healthcare system, was about to make sure that truth came with consequences that would echo through every hospital corridor in the city. But first, he had to save his wife's life. The real emergency was about to begin. Dr. Eric Monroe had been in surgery for 14 straight hours when his phone buzzed with Diana's voicemail. He almost didn't listen to it. Emergency medicine had taught him to compartmentalize, to focus on the patient in front of him rather than the constant stream of calls and messages that defined a doctor's life. But something in the preview of her voice, the way it broke on his name, made him pause in the hospital corridor and press play. Eric, I'm at Mercy General. Something's wrong with my heart. They won't listen. The phone nearly slipped from his hands. Diana never asked for help. In their 12 years of marriage, through medical school, residency, and building their respective careers, she had been the stronger one, the anchor that kept him grounded when the weight of saving lives threatened to crush his spirit. For her to call him, to sound so desperate and afraid. He was already running toward the parking garage before the message finished playing. Eric Monroe hadn't always been the kind of man who could shut down hospitals with a phone call. 25 years ago, he'd been a kid from Detroit's East Side whose mother worked double shifts as a hospital custodian just to keep food on the table. He'd studied in supply closets while she cleaned, done homework by the light of vending machines, and learned early that hospitals were places where people like his family came to die, not to be saved. The scholarship to University of Michigan had been his escape route, but medical school had nearly broken him. Not the coursework, he'd always been brilliant with books, but the constant reminder that he didn't belong. The subtle questions about affirmative action, the surprise in professors' voices when he excelled, the way patients sometimes asked for the real doctor when he walked into their rooms. But Diana had changed everything. He'd met her during his cardiothoracic surgery residency at Johns Hopkins, where she was completing her fellowship in interventional cardiology. She'd been the first person in the medical field who saw his capabilities before his color, who challenged him intellectually without condescension, who believed in his potential even when he couldn't see it himself. Their first conversation had been an argument about treatment protocols that lasted 3 hours and ended with both of them exhausted, exhilarated, and completely smitten. She'd been fearless then, willing to go toe-to-toe with attending physicians twice her age, fighting for her patients with a passion that sometimes bordered on reckless. That fearlessness had carried them through everything. Through the challenges of being an interracial couple in medicine, through the long hours and emotional toll of their specialties, through his rise to department head and eventually to his current role overseeing healthcare policy for the entire tri-state region. Diana had been his partner in every sense, the brilliant cardiologist who could spot a heart attack from across a room, who had never been wrong about a cardiac emergency in her entire career. If she said something was wrong with her heart, something was catastrophically wrong. Eric's BMW tore through the streets toward Mercy General, his mind racing through the possibilities. Mercy General was one of the hospitals in his network, a place he'd visited dozens of times for administrative meetings and quality reviews. The staff knew who he was, respected his authority. Diana would be getting the best care possible. That certainty sustained him until he pulled into the emergency bay and saw the crowd gathered around a figure on the ground. His wife lay unconscious on the cold asphalt, her dark skin ashen, her breathing shallow and irregular. A paramedic was attaching cardiac monitors while another established in full line, their movements urgent but controlled. Diana's designer coat was splayed around her like broken wings, and her purse had spilled its contents across the pavement. Lip gloss, car keys, her hospital ID badge from Riverside Medical where she worked. What happened? Eric demanded, dropping to his knees beside the paramedics. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, but underneath was the raw terror of a man watching his world collapse. Found her collapsed out here about 10 minutes ago, the lead paramedic replied without looking up. Classic presentation of myocardial infarction. Looks like she's been down for a while. Bystander said they saw her stumble out of the ER and fall. She was inside. Eric's voice went dangerously quiet. She was in the ER and they let her walk out. The paramedic finally looked up, recognizing something lethal in Eric's tone. Sir, are you family? I'm her husband. And I'm Dr. Eric Monroe, Regional Director of Health Systems. The effect was immediate. The paramedic's eyes widened, and Eric could see him mentally reviewing everything he'd just said, looking for any mistakes or oversights. In the background, someone from the hospital staff had approached and was now backing away, phone pressed to their ear, undoubtedly calling administrators who were about to have the worst night of their careers. Dr. Monroe, the paramedic said carefully, we're going to take her to Metro General. They have the best cardiac unit. No. Eric's voice cut through the night air like a blade. She goes to Mercy General. Right here. Right now. Sir, with respect, given her condition. Given her condition, she needs immediate intervention, and moving her across town could kill her. Eric's hands were already checking Diana's pulse, his trained fingers finding the irregular rhythm that confirmed his worst fears. And given that she was already inside this hospital asking for help, someone needs to explain to me why my wife nearly died in a parking lot. The paramedics exchanged glances. They'd been in emergency medicine long enough to recognize the kind of storm that was about to break over Mercy General, and they wanted no part of it. As they loaded Diana onto a stretcher, Eric caught sight of a familiar face through the emergency room windows. Dr. James Patterson, Mercy General's chief of emergency medicine, stood frozen behind the glass doors, his face pale with the realization of what had just happened under his watch. 20 years ago, James Patterson had been Eric's mentor during his residency rotation. He'd been one of the good ones, the attending physicians who saw potential rather than problems, who had pushed Eric to be better while protecting him from the worst of the institutional biases that could destroy a promising career. But as Eric met his eyes through the glass, he saw something that chilled him more than Diana's cardiac arrest. He saw guilt. James Patterson knew something. And whatever he knew had nearly cost Diana her life. The automatic doors slid open as the paramedics wheeled Diana inside, and the organized chaos of emergency medicine immediately surrounded them. Nurses appeared with equipment, technicians wheeled over monitors, and residents began the carefully choreographed dance of trauma response. But Eric noticed what they didn't see. The way some of the staff looked at Diana, the subtle hesitation before they touched her, the professional distance that was just a degree colder than it should have been. He'd learned to read these microaggressions over the years, the tiny indicators that revealed how people really felt beneath their professional facades. Get her to Trauma Bay 3, Dr. Patterson commanded, his voice steady but his hands shaking slightly as he approached Eric. Eric, I'm so sorry. Don't. Eric's voice was barely controlled fury. Don't you dare apologize to me until you explain how my wife walked into your emergency room with obvious cardiac symptoms and ended up collapsed in your parking lot. Dr. Patterson's face went even paler. There may have been a miscommunication at triage. A miscommunication. Eric stepped closer, and Patterson instinctively backed away. My wife is one of the most respected cardiologists in the state. She's never wrong about cardiac emergencies. So either your staff is incompetent, or something else happened here tonight. Through the trauma bay windows, Eric could see the medical team working on Diana, EKG leads being attached, blood being drawn, medications being prepared. But he could also see Nurse Linda Nakamura standing just outside the bay, her face a mask of professional composure that didn't quite hide the panic in her eyes. She was the first person Diana would have encountered. The gatekeeper who decided who got help and who got dismissed. I want to speak with whoever was working triage tonight, Eric said quietly, never taking his eyes off Rebecca. Right now. Eric, maybe we should wait until Diana is stable. No. Eric turned back to Patterson, and the older man actually flinched at what he saw in his former student's eyes. We're going to have that conversation now, because I need to understand how a hospital in my network, under my oversight, nearly killed my wife through negligence or bias or whatever the hell happened here tonight. Dr. Patterson looked around the emergency room, suddenly aware that every conversation had stopped. Every pair of eyes was watching this confrontation unfold. The staff knew who Eric Monroe was. His authority extended far beyond this single hospital. He controlled funding, policies, and ultimately, careers. Rebecca, Patterson called reluctantly. Can you join us, please? Nurse Linda Nakamura had been dreading this moment since she'd heard Eric Monroe's name, but she'd been hoping for time to prepare, to craft an explanation that might save her career. Instead, she found herself walking toward two of the most powerful men in the hospital, knowing that the next few minutes would determine not just her future, but potentially the future of everyone who worked here. Dr. Monroe, she said carefully, I want you to know that we're doing everything possible for your wife. What I want to know, Eric interrupted, is why you turned her away. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Linda felt her carefully prepared explanations crumble as she looked into Eric's eyes and saw not just anger, but a deeper pain, the recognition of something she'd hoped he would never have to witness. She didn't present as a typical cardiac case, Linda said, falling back on medical terminology as a shield. Young, ambulatory, no obvious distress indicators. She told you she was having chest pain. She said she couldn't breathe properly. That could indicate. She told you she was a physician. Rebecca's mouth opened and closed. There was no medical protocol that justified dismissing a colleague's assessment of their own symptoms, especially not cardiac symptoms. I followed standard triage procedures. No. Eric's voice carried the weight of absolute authority now. You made a decision about my wife the moment you saw her. You decided she wasn't worth your immediate attention. You decided her pain wasn't real. You decided that a woman of her appearance was probably exaggerating or lying or drug-seeking. That's not. I would never. Then explain it to me. Eric stepped closer, and Linda could feel the attention of the entire emergency room focused on this moment. Explain how a trained nurse with 23 years of experience couldn't recognize a textbook presentation of myocardial infarction in a woman who specifically told you what was happening to her. Linda Nakamura had built her career on competence and professionalism. She'd saved countless lives, had worked through disasters and tragedies, had earned the respect of colleagues and patients alike. But standing here, facing the husband of the woman she'd nearly killed through her assumptions and biases, she couldn't find words to defend the indefensible. Because Eric Monroe was right. She had made a decision about Diana Whitmore the moment she'd seen her, had decided that a well-dressed black woman claiming cardiac symptoms was probably seeking attention or drugs or special treatment she hadn't earned. And that decision had nearly cost a brilliant doctor her life. Dr. Monroe, Dr. Patterson interjected, clearly trying to defuse the situation. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. No. Eric never took his eyes off Rebecca. This happened in public, in front of patients and families who watched my wife get dismissed and humiliated. So we're going to address it in public. He turned to address the entire emergency room, his voice carrying to every corner of the space. I want everyone here to understand something. What happened to my wife tonight, what nearly killed her, wasn't a medical error. It wasn't a staffing shortage or a system failure. It was bias. Pure and simple. And it's going to stop. Tonight. The emergency room had gone completely silent. Even the ambient sounds of medical equipment seemed muted as staff, patients, and families absorbed what they were witnessing. Linda Nakamura, Eric continued, you are suspended pending a full investigation. Security will escort you out. Dr. Patterson, you and I are going to have a very long conversation about the culture in this emergency room and how we're going to change it. Eric, please. Patterson tried again. And if anyone thinks this is about me using my position to protect my family, Eric's voice rose slightly, carrying to every corner of the room. You're wrong. This is about protecting every patient who walks through these doors. Because if this can happen to Dr. Diana Whitmore, a respected physician with insurance and connections and a husband who runs the healthcare system, what happens to everyone else? The question echoed in the stunned silence of the emergency room, and Eric could see the recognition dawning on faces throughout the space. Staff members who had witnessed similar dismissals, patients who had experienced their own moments of being judged and found wanting, families who had felt the sting of assumptions based on their appearance or accent or insurance status. Dr. Monroe. A resident's voice called urgently from Trauma Bay 3. We need you. The confrontation dissolved instantly as Eric rushed toward his wife, but the damage was done. Word was already spreading through the hospital's corridors. Phones were buzzing with messages, and administrators were being pulled from their homes to deal with a crisis that threatened to expose problems that went far deeper than one nurse's poor judgment. As Eric pushed through the trauma bay doors to be with Diana, he had no idea that his words had been recorded by a patient's family member and were already being uploaded to social media. The reckoning he'd demanded wasn't going to be confined to Mercy General's walls. The entire city was about to discover what happened when bias masqueraded as medical care, and how one man's love for his wife would force a healthcare system to confront its ugliest truths. But first, Diana had to survive the night. And that was far from certain. The trauma bay erupted in controlled chaos as Eric pushed through the doors. Diana's body convulsed on the gurney, her back arching as the defibrillator delivered another shock to her failing heart. The monitors screamed their electronic warnings, blood pressure dropping, oxygen saturation plummeting, cardiac rhythm deteriorating into the jagged pattern that meant death was winning. Third shock, charging to 360, called Dr. Sarah Kim, the cardiothoracic resident whose hands moved with practiced precision despite the fear in her eyes. She'd heard every word of the confrontation outside, knew that the woman dying in front of her was married to the man who controlled the funding for her residency program. I've got it, Eric said quietly, moving to the head of the bed. Every instinct screamed at him to take over, to push aside the residents and save his wife himself. But 25 years in medicine had taught him that emotion and surgical precision didn't mix. Instead, he took Diana's hand, feeling for the pulse point at her wrist while his trained eye tracked the monitors. Talk to me, Dr. Kim, he said, his voice steadying the entire team with its calm authority. What's her status? Massive anterior wall MI, Sarah replied, grateful for his composure. Complete blockage of the LAD based on the EKG pattern. We've established venous access, given aspirin, heparin, and morphine for pain management. But she needs the cath lab immediately. Every minute we delay increases the damage to her heart muscle. Eric nodded, his fingers finding the weak but regular pulse at Diana's wrist. The worst of the arrhythmia had passed, but he could feel how hard her heart was working, how close she'd come to losing the battle entirely. How long from onset to treatment? He asked, though he already knew the answer would tear him apart. Dr. Kim's pause told him everything. Based on the enzyme levels, approximately 4 to 5 minutes from the time she first presented to the ER. 4 to 5 minutes. In cardiac medicine, that was an eternity, the difference between full recovery and permanent disability, between life and a slow, inevitable decline toward heart failure. Diana had spent nearly an hour dying while Linda Nakamura decided whether her pain was worth believing. Dr. Monroe. Dr. Patterson's voice came from behind him, carefully controlled. The cath lab is being prepped now. Dr. Rodriguez is on his way in. He's the best interventional cardiologist we have. No. Eric didn't turn around, his attention focused entirely on Diana's face as she began to stir, consciousness returning in fragments. Call Dr. Michael Stevens at Presbyterian Hospital. He trained with Diana at Hopkins. He knows her cardiac anatomy better than anyone. Eric, Dr. Rodriguez is excellent, and the delay in transport is negligible compared to having someone who's performed procedures on Diana before. Eric finally looked up, and Patterson saw something in his eyes that made him step back. My wife's heart has a rare anatomical variant, a left circumflex artery that branches unusually. Dr. Rodriguez won't know to look for it. Dr. Stevens will. The room fell silent except for the beeping monitors. Everyone present understood the implication. Eric Monroe was so distrustful of Mercy General's capabilities that he was willing to risk his wife's life to get her treated elsewhere. Sir, Dr. Kim ventured carefully. Presbyterian is 20 minutes away, and in her current condition. Then we stabilize her for transport. Eric's tone brooked no argument. Continuous cardiac monitoring, portable defibrillator, and I ride with her. Non-negotiable. Dr. Patterson looked stricken. In 30 years of emergency medicine, he'd never had a patient's family essentially vote no confidence in his entire department. But more than his professional ego was at stake. Word of this decision would spread through the medical community like wildfire. If Eric Monroe didn't trust Mercy General to treat his wife, What would that say about the quality of care for everyone else? Eric. Diana's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the tension like a blade. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused but aware. What? Where? You're safe, Eric said immediately, leaning close enough that she could see his face clearly. You had a heart attack, sweetheart. We're getting you the best care possible. Diana's medical training kicked in even through the haze of pain medication. She could feel the irregular rhythm of her own heart, could interpret the worried expressions around her, could read the monitors that told the story of how close she'd come to dying. How long? She asked, the question every cardiac patient dreaded. How long had her heart been starved of oxygen? How much permanent damage had been done? 4 to 5 minutes from onset to treatment, Eric said quietly, and Diana's eyes closed in despair. She knew what that meant better than anyone, knew that pieces of her heart muscle were already dead, that her life as she'd known it might be over. The nurse, Diana whispered, memory flooding back. She wouldn't listen. I told her I was a doctor. I told her what was happening, and she... I know. Eric's voice carried a weight of fury that made everyone in the trauma bay uncomfortable. And she's going to face consequences. But right now, we focus on you. Dr. Monroe. A new voice interrupted from the doorway. Hospital Administrator Margaret Walsh stood just outside the trauma bay, her face carefully composed but her hands shaking slightly. Behind her, Eric could see 2 more administrators and what looked like the hospital's legal counsel. The cavalry had arrived, but they were 20 minutes too late to prevent the disaster. Mrs. Walsh, Eric acknowledged without moving from Diana's side. I assume you're here to discuss damage control. Margaret Walsh had been preparing for this conversation during her frantic drive to the hospital, but standing here looking at Dr. Monroe, one of the most powerful men in regional healthcare, holding his wife's hand while she recovered from a preventable heart attack, all her carefully rehearsed words seemed inadequate. Dr. Monroe, I want to personally apologize for what happened tonight. We're conducting a full investigation, and I can assure you that appropriate disciplinary action. Disciplinary action. Eric's voice carried just loud enough for patients and families in the adjacent areas to hear. Mrs. Walsh, your triage nurse nearly killed my wife through racial bias masquerading as medical judgment. Disciplinary action doesn't begin to address the systemic failures that made this possible. The word racial hung in the air like an accusation that no one wanted to acknowledge but everyone understood. Margaret Walsh felt her carefully prepared talking points crumble as she realized this wasn't going to be contained with standard hospital protocols. Sir, if we could perhaps discuss this privately. No. Eric stood slowly, his presence suddenly dominating the space in a way that made everyone step back. Privacy is what allowed this to happen in the first place. Private biases, private assumptions, private decisions that nearly cost my wife her life. Diana struggled to sit up, her medical instincts overriding her physical weakness. She could see the battle lines being drawn around her bed, could feel the weight of institutional power preparing to crush whatever momentum Eric's anger had created. Eric, she said softly, and he immediately turned back to her. Don't do this for me. Do it for all the patients who don't have your name or your position. Do it for the woman who'll come in here tomorrow night and get dismissed because someone decides her pain isn't worth believing. The words hit everyone in the room like physical blows. Diana Whitmore, lying in a hospital bed recovering from a heart attack caused by medical negligence, was thinking about future victims rather than her own suffering. Dr. Kim said quietly, we really need to get you to Presbyterian Hospital for the cardiac catheterization. Wait. Diana's voice was stronger now, fueled by determination that surprised everyone. I want to make a statement first. While I'm still here, while people can see what bias looks like when it almost kills someone. Margaret Walsh went pale. A public statement from Diana Monroe would be a public relations catastrophe that could destroy careers and trigger investigations far beyond Mercy General's walls. Mrs. Monroe, perhaps when you're feeling better. I am Dr. Monroe, Diana corrected sharply, and the administrator flinched at the steel in her voice. And I'm feeling clear enough to know that if we don't address this now, tonight, nothing will change. Another woman will die because someone decides she's not worth saving. Eric looked at his wife with a mixture of love and awe. Even after everything she'd endured, Diana was thinking like the physician she'd always been, focused on preventing future harm rather than seeking personal revenge. What do you want to do? He asked quietly. I want to talk to that nurse, Diana said, struggling to sit up further. Linda Nakamura. I want her to look at me, really look at me, and understand what her assumptions cost. The request sent shockwaves through the assembled administrators. Bringing Linda Nakamura face-to-face with Diana Monroe would create a moment of accountability that could destroy the nurse's career and expose the hospital to massive liability. That's not advisable. The legal counsel finally spoke up. From a liability standpoint. I don't care about liability, Diana interrupted. I care about change. And change doesn't happen through disciplinary memos and sensitivity training. It happens when people are forced to confront the consequences of their actions. Margaret Walsh looked desperately at Dr. Patterson, who had been conspicuously silent during the exchange. As chief of emergency medicine, he had the authority to refuse Diana's request, to cite medical protocols and patient safety. Instead, he surprised everyone. Mrs. Monroe, Dr. Monroe, is right, Patterson said quietly. I've been running this emergency room for 12 years, and I've seen this happen before. Different patients, different circumstances, but the same underlying problem. We treat symptoms instead of causes, and people suffer for it. The admission was professional suicide, but Patterson had watched Linda Nakamura's face during the earlier confrontation and had seen something that terrified him. She genuinely didn't understand what she'd done wrong. In her mind, she'd followed proper protocols, had been appropriately cautious, had done her job competently. That disconnect, between Rebecca's perception and reality, was the real crisis. Bring her in, Patterson said to Margaret Walsh. Let her see what her proper procedures accomplished. As word spread that Linda Nakamura was being summoned back to the trauma bay, the entire emergency room buzzed with tension. Staff members who had worked with Linda for years struggled to reconcile the competent, caring nurse they knew with the woman who had dismissed a heart attack patient. Patients and families in the waiting area whispered among themselves, their phones already documenting a confrontation that was about to become very public very quickly. And in Trauma Bay 3, Diana Monroe prepared to look into the eyes of the woman who had nearly killed her, not for revenge, but for something far more dangerous to the status quo, truth. Because the real catastrophe wasn't Diana's heart attack, it was the revelation that bias had become so embedded in medical care that good people could commit terrible acts while believing they were simply doing their jobs. And once that truth was exposed, there would be no going back to the comfortable fiction that discrimination was someone else's problem in someone else's hospital. The reckoning Diana and Eric had set in motion was about to become unstoppable. Linda Nakamura stood outside Trauma Bay 3, her hands trembling as she watched through the window. Diana Monroe, Dr. Monroe, sat propped up in the hospital bed, cardiac monitors still beeping their steady rhythm around her, for lines snaking from both arms. But her eyes were alert, focused, and filled with a determination that made Rebecca's stomach clench with dread. She wants to see you, Dr. Patterson said quietly, approaching from behind. His voice carried none of its usual authority, just exhaustion and something that might have been disappointment. You don't have to go in there, Rebecca. The union rep is on his way, and legally. No. Rebecca's voice cracked slightly. I need to understand what happened. But even as she said the words, Linda wasn't sure she was ready for that understanding. For 23 years, she'd prided herself on being colorblind in her medical care, on treating every patient with equal professionalism regardless of their background. The idea that she might have failed so catastrophically challenged everything she believed about herself. Through the window, she could see Eric Monroe standing beside his wife's bed, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. The intimacy of the gesture, the way Diana leaned slightly into his touch, the way his thumb traced gentle circles against her skin, revealed a depth of connection that made Linda feel like an intruder just for watching. She'd seen hundreds of couples in crisis situations, but there was something different about the Monroes. They moved together like partners who had faced adversity before and emerged stronger, who trusted each other completely even when the world around them was falling apart. Dr. Patterson. Margaret Walsh's voice interrupted from down the corridor, sharp with barely controlled panic. We have a problem. She approached with her phone in hand, her face pale as she showed them the screen. A video was playing, shaky, shot from a patient's family member's perspective, but the audio was crystal clear. Eric Monroe's voice carried across the emergency room as he confronted Linda and declared his intention to shut down the systemic failures that had nearly killed his wife. It's been shared 400 times in the last 20 minutes, Margaret said, her voice hollow. Local news outlets are picking it up. The mayor's office has called twice. And we just got word that the state health department is launching an immediate investigation. Linda felt the blood drain from her face. A state investigation meant her nursing license could be suspended, her career destroyed, her reputation in ruins. But worse than the professional consequences was the growing realization that she might actually deserve them. "How many?" she asked quietly. "How many what?" Dr. Patterson replied. "How many other patients have I?" Linda couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Everyone understood what she was asking. The question hung in the air like an accusation none of them wanted to answer. Because if Linda Nakamura, competent, experienced, respected Linda Nakamura, could dismiss a heart attack patient based on unconscious bias, how many other medical professionals were making similar judgments every day? "We need to contain this," Margaret Walsh said, her administrator's instincts kicking in. "Rebecca, I'm placing you on administrative leave effective immediately. Dr. Patterson, I need you to review all patient interactions from the past month, identify any potential issues." "Stop." Diana's voice carried through the trauma bay window, weak but commanding. "Stop trying to manage this like a PR crisis and start treating it like what it is, a medical emergency that's been years in the making." They turned to see Diana struggling to sit up straighter, ignoring the protests from the cardiac monitors. Eric moved to steady her, his touch gentle but his expression fierce as he looked at the administrators outside. "Mrs. Monroe," Margaret began, "perhaps we should wait until you're feeling stronger." "It's Dr. Monroe," Diana corrected for the third time that night, her voice carrying an edge that made everyone step back. "And I'm feeling strong enough to know that while you're all standing around discussing damage control, there's probably another patient in this emergency room right now who's being dismissed because someone decided their pain isn't worth believing." The accusation hit like a physical blow, and Margaret Walsh found herself looking around the emergency room with new eyes. At the triage desk, a young Hispanic woman held a crying infant, explaining in accented English that her baby had been vomiting all day. The nurse, a different one, thankfully, not Rebecca, was asking detailed questions about insurance coverage before addressing the medical concerns. In the waiting area, an elderly black man sat hunched over, favoring his left side in a way that suggested abdominal pain. But he'd been there for over an hour without being called back for assessment. And near the vending machines, a teenage girl with multiple piercings and dyed black hair quietly bled through a bandage on her wrist while her mother filled out paperwork, both of them clearly uncomfortable under the judgmental stares of other patients. "Rebecca," Diana called softly, and the nurse looked up to meet her eyes through the window. "Please come in. I need to ask you something." Linda Nakamura walked into that trauma bay knowing her career was over, but also knowing she owed Diana Monroe, Dr. Monroe, at least the courage to face what she had done. The cardiac monitors seemed to beep louder as she approached the bed, each electronic heartbeat a reminder of how close Diana had come to dying. "Dr. Monroe," Linda began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I want you to know that I never intended." "Tell me what you saw," Diana interrupted gently. "When I walked up to your desk tonight, what did you see?" The question caught Linda off guard. She'd been prepared for anger, for accusations, for legal threats. She hadn't been prepared for what felt like a genuine attempt to understand. "I saw." Linda struggled to find words that wouldn't damn her further. "I saw a woman who appeared to be in distress but was still ambulatory, well-dressed, articulate. Young," Diana added quietly. "Black. Confident. Someone who probably had good insurance and connections." Rebecca's silence was answer enough. "What you didn't see," Diana continued, her voice steady despite the pain medication, "was a cardiologist who'd been having chest discomfort for 3 hours before coming to the ER. You didn't see someone who'd already taken an aspirin and nitroglycerine at home with no relief. You didn't see a woman who was terrified because she knew exactly what was happening to her body and couldn't make anyone listen." Each word landed like a blow, but Diana's tone remained calm, almost clinical. She was teaching, Linda realized, the way good physicians taught medical students, by walking them through differential diagnosis and critical thinking. "But more than that," Diana continued, "you didn't see me at all. You saw your assumptions about who deserves immediate care and who can wait. About whose pain is real and whose might be exaggerated. About which patients are likely to be drug-seeking or attention-seeking versus those who have legitimate emergencies." Linda felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact. "You're right," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I let my biases affect my medical judgment." "It's not enough," Eric said quietly from beside the bed, and Linda flinched at the steel in his voice. "Being sorry doesn't undo the damage to my wife's heart. It doesn't change the fact that she collapsed in a parking lot because you decided she wasn't worth your time." "Eric," Diana said softly, squeezing his hand. She knows. The question is what we do now. Through the trauma bay window, they could see the emergency room erupting into controlled chaos. More administrators had arrived, along with what appeared to be a crisis management team. News vans were pulling into the parking lot, and security guards were being positioned at the entrances. But inside Trauma Bay 3, a different kind of reckoning was taking place. "Rebecca," Diana said, "I want you to think about every patient you've ever dismissed. Every person whose pain you minimized because they didn't fit your expectations of what a real emergency looks like. I want you to consider how many people might have suffered because of split-second judgments based on their appearance, their accent, their insurance status, or their skin color." The words hung in the air like an indictment, and Linda felt something breaking inside her chest. Not her heart, but something deeper. The comfortable fiction she'd maintained about her own impartiality. The belief that good intentions were enough to overcome unconscious bias. "There was a woman last month," Linda admitted, her voice cracking. "Came in complaining of severe headache. Young, multiple piercings, no insurance. I thought she was drug-seeking, made her wait 4 hours. When she finally got seen, her blood pressure was 200/110. She could have had a stroke." Diana nodded slowly. "Anyone else?" "An elderly man with chest pain. But he was homeless, and I thought he just wanted a warm place to sleep." Rebecca's voice grew smaller with each confession. "And a teenage girl who said she was having abdominal pain. She was pregnant and scared, but I assumed she was lying about her symptoms to get attention." Each admission felt like another weight added to Rebecca's shoulders. But Diana listened without judgment, her expression remaining calm and professional. "Those are the ones you remember," Diana said quietly. "How many others were there? How many patients walked away because they felt dismissed and unwelcome? How many suffered in silence because they learned that their pain didn't matter to the people who were supposed to help them?" The questions echoed in the small space, unanswerable but devastating in their implications. "Dr. Monroe," Margaret Walsh's voice came from the doorway, tight with barely controlled panic. "The media is requesting a statement. Channel 7 has a crew setting up outside, and the Chronicle wants to interview you about systemic bias in healthcare." Diana looked at her husband, seeing the storm building behind his eyes. Eric Monroe was a man accustomed to solving problems through policy and procedure, through systematic reform and institutional pressure. But this problem was personal, and personal wounds required different medicine. "We're not giving statements," Diana said firmly. "Not yet. First, we're going to fix what's broken here." "Dr. Monroe," the legal counsel spoke up from behind Margaret, "I strongly advise against any admissions of institutional liability." "I don't care about liability," Diana interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "I care about the patient who's going to walk through those doors tomorrow night and face the same dismissal I did. I care about the woman who'll collapse in a different parking lot because someone decided her pain wasn't real." She turned back to Rebecca, who stood frozen beside the bed like a defendant awaiting sentencing. "Rebecca, you have a choice," Diana said. "You can disappear into administrative leave and let the lawyers handle this, or you can help us fix the system that created this problem. You can be part of the solution instead of just another casualty of institutional bias." The offer stunned everyone in the room. Diana Monroe was giving the woman who had nearly killed her a chance at redemption, an opportunity to transform personal failure into systematic change. What would that look like?" Linda asked tentatively. "It looks like honesty," Eric said, stepping forward. "Complete transparency about how bias influences medical decisions. It looks like training programs that force healthcare workers to confront their unconscious assumptions. It looks like accountability systems that don't just punish individual failures but address the cultural problems that make those failures inevitable." Outside the trauma bay, they could see Dr. Patterson fielding calls, his face growing more haggard with each conversation. The state health department investigation was expanding to include the entire hospital network, and early reports suggested this wasn't an isolated incident. But inside the small room, something unprecedented was happening. Victim and perpetrator were beginning to work together toward justice that went far beyond personal revenge. "Dr. Monroe," Linda said quietly, "if I do this, if I cooperate with the investigation and training programs, what happens to my career?" Diana exchanged a look with her husband, seeing the same understanding in his eyes that she felt in her own heart. This was bigger than Linda Nakamura's career, bigger than Mercy General Hospital, bigger than their personal trauma. This was about transforming a system that had been broken for so long that most people had stopped seeing the damage it caused. That depends, Diana said, on whether you're willing to do the work to earn redemption. Real work. Hard work. The kind of work that means facing every unconscious bias you've ever harbored and committing to do better. Before Linda could respond, Dr. Kim burst through the trauma bay doors, her face flushed with urgency. Dr. Monroe, we need to get you to Presbyterian immediately. The enzymes show continuing cardiac damage, and Dr. Stevens is standing by in the cath lab. Every minute we delay. I know, Diana said, but she didn't move to leave. Instead, she looked around the room at the faces of people whose lives had been irrevocably changed by this night's events. Promise me, she said to Rebecca, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had nearly died for another person's assumptions. Promise me that no other patient will ever feel what I felt tonight. That no one else will be dismissed and humiliated because someone decided their pain wasn't worth believing. Linda Nakamura looked into the eyes of the woman she had failed so catastrophically and made a promise that would define the rest of her career. I promise. And I'll spend however long it takes to make it right. As the paramedics prepared to transport Diana to Presbyterian Hospital, the emergency room around them continued to buzz with crisis management and media attention. But the real transformation had already begun, not in the boardrooms or policy meetings that would follow, but in the simple recognition that healing institutional bias required acknowledging individual failure. And as Diana Monroe was wheeled toward the ambulance that would take her to the cardiac catheterization that might save her life, she carried with her something more valuable than personal vindication: the beginning of systematic change that could save countless other lives. But the hardest battles were still ahead, because changing hearts and minds was infinitely more difficult than repairing damaged cardiac tissue. The night was far from over, and the real test of everyone's commitment to justice was about to begin. The ambulance had barely cleared Mercy General's parking lot when Diana's world exploded into chaos again. The cardiac monitors erupted in a symphony of alarms as her heart rhythm deteriorated from stable to life-threatening in the span of seconds. She's going into VFib, the paramedic shouted, reaching for the defibrillator paddles. Sir, I need you to move back. Eric pressed himself against the ambulance wall, helpless as electricity coursed through his wife's body, her back arching against the restraints. Through the small rear window, he could see the lights of Presbyterian Hospital still miles away, each second of distance feeling like an eternity. Come on, Diana, he whispered, watching the monitors as her heart fought to find its rhythm again. Come back to me. But even as the paramedics worked to stabilize her, Eric's phone was buzzing with calls that would shatter everything he thought he understood about the crisis they'd just left behind. Dr. Monroe. The voice belonged to Dr. Jennifer Walsh, no relation to the hospital administrator but rather the state health department's chief investigator. I'm sorry to call during this difficult time, but we've uncovered something you need to know immediately. Eric's blood ran cold. What kind of something? Our preliminary investigation into Mercy General has revealed a pattern of similar incidents dating back 3 years. We're looking at least 12 documented cases of patients, predominantly minority patients, who received substandard care or were inappropriately discharged from emergency departments. The ambulance hit a pothole, and Diana's body jerked against the restraints, the monitors screaming again. But Eric's attention was completely focused on the devastating words coming through his phone. 12 cases, he repeated, his voice barely audible above the medical equipment. Dr. Monroe, 2 of those patients died. The words hit him like a physical blow. 2 people had died from the same systematic bias that had nearly killed Diana. 2 families had lost loved ones because healthcare workers had made assumptions about who deserved immediate care and who could wait. Which hospitals? Eric asked, though part of him already knew the answer would destroy him. 4 different facilities. All within your regional network. All under your administrative oversight. Eric closed his eyes, the full weight of complicity settling on his shoulders like a crushing burden. For 3 years, he'd been the regional director of health systems, responsible for quality control, patient safety protocols, and institutional accountability. For 3 years, people had been dying because of biases he'd failed to identify and address. Dr. Monroe, the investigator continued, there's something else. We found evidence that at least some of these incidents were reported internally but never escalated to state level. Someone has been covering this up. The ambulance lurched to a stop as they reached Presbyterian Hospital, but Eric barely noticed. His mind was reeling with the implications of systematic cover-ups within his own network. Who? He demanded. Who's been hiding this? We're still investigating, but the pattern suggests someone with significant administrative authority. Someone who could suppress incident reports and influence personnel decisions. As the paramedics rushed Diana into Presbyterian's emergency bay, Eric found himself standing alone in the hospital corridor, his phone still pressed to his ear, learning that the woman he loved had nearly become the latest victim in a pattern of medical negligence he'd been unknowingly enabling for years. Dr. Monroe. Dr. Michael Stevens appeared at his elbow, the interventional cardiologist Diana had requested. We need to get her to the cath lab immediately. How's she doing? She's. Eric struggled to focus on his wife's immediate medical needs while his professional world collapsed around him. She went into VFib during transport. The damage to her heart might be more extensive than we initially thought. Dr. Stevens nodded grimly. The longer the delay in treatment, the more cardiac muscle we lose. But Diana's strong, and she knows her own anatomy better than anyone. If anyone can get through this, it's her. As they rushed toward the cardiac catheterization laboratory, Eric's phone buzzed again. This time, the caller ID made his stomach drop. Dr. James Patterson. Eric, thank God you answered. Patterson's voice was strained, desperate. You need to know that things are falling apart here. The state investigators are demanding access to personnel files, incident reports, patient records. Good, Eric said coldly. Maybe they'll find what I should have found years ago. You don't understand, Patterson continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. They are asking specifically about cases I reported to your office. Cases where I requested intervention and was told to handle them internally. Eric stopped walking so abruptly that Dr. Stevens had to grab his arm to keep him from falling. What did you just say? The incident reports, Eric. I sent dozens of them to your administrative office over the past 3 years. Situations like what happened to Diana tonight. I asked for policy reviews, bias training, additional oversight. But I was always told that individual counseling and internal discipline were sufficient. The corridor around Eric seemed to tilt and blur. He'd never seen those reports. In 3 years as regional director, he'd never received a single incident report suggesting systematic bias in emergency care. James, I never saw any reports from you. Not one. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. That's impossible, Patterson finally whispered. I sent them directly to your office, through official channels. I have copies of everything, including the responses from your administrative staff telling me the matters had been addressed. Eric's mind raced through the implications. Someone in his own office had been intercepting reports, suppressing evidence of systematic bias, and forging responses in his name. Someone he trusted, someone with access to his official correspondence, someone who could manipulate the very systems designed to protect patients. Dr. Monroe. Dr. Stevens was looking at him with concern. We really need to get to the cath lab. But Eric's phone was buzzing again, this time with a text message from Margaret Walsh at Mercy General. Media has obtained leaked documents. Story goes live in 1 hour. You need to see this. The message included a photo of an internal memo, dated 6 months ago, bearing Eric's electronic signature. The memo explicitly instructed emergency department staff to prioritize patients with private insurance and to use clinical judgment when determining the urgency of care for challenging patients. Eric stared at the document in horror. He'd never written those words, never authorized that policy, never even seen the memo before this moment. But his signature was there, authentic-looking enough to convince any investigator that Dr. Eric Monroe had personally endorsed the discriminatory practices that had nearly killed his wife. This is impossible, he whispered. But even as he said the words, he knew how it would look to investigators, to the media, to the families of patients who had died under policies bearing his name. Dr. Monroe, Dr. Stevens said urgently. Diana's condition is deteriorating. We need to move now. But Eric's legs felt like lead as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. Someone in his inner circle, someone he'd trusted with administrative authority, had been systematically covering up bias incidents while forging documents that would make him appear complicit in the very discrimination he'd spent his career fighting. As they entered the cardiac catheterization lab, Eric saw Diana unconscious on the table, her body connected to multiple machines that were keeping her alive while Dr. Stevens prepared to repair the damage to her heart. But the damage to Eric's professional reputation, to his ability to fight for systematic change, might be irreparable. His phone rang again. This time, it was Dr. Patricia Williams, the deputy regional director who had been his second-in-command for 2 years. Eric, her voice was carefully controlled. I just heard about Diana. How terrible. I want you to know that I'm handling all the administrative fallout from tonight's incident. You don't need to worry about anything except your wife's recovery. Something in her tone set off alarm bells in Eric's mind. Patricia had always been efficient, always helpful, always eager to handle the administrative details that Eric found tedious. She'd been the one who managed his correspondence, who reviewed and responded to routine reports, who kept his office running smoothly while he focused on big-picture policy issues. She'd been the one with access to his electronic signature, with authority to respond to incident reports in his name, with the power to suppress information that might reflect poorly on the healthcare system they both managed. Patricia, Eric said carefully, did you ever receive incident reports from Dr. Patterson at Mercy General? Reports about potential bias in emergency care. The pause was infinitesimal, but Eric caught it. I handle hundreds of reports every month, Eric. I can't recall specific. Did you forge my signature on policy documents? This time, the pause stretched long enough for Eric to hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. I think you're under tremendous stress right now, Patricia said finally, her voice taking on a patronizing tone he'd never heard before. Perhaps we should discuss this when you're thinking more clearly. The deflection confirmed his worst fears. Dr. Patricia Williams, his trusted deputy, his colleague, someone he'd considered a friend, had been systematically sabotaging his efforts to address bias in healthcare while positioning him to take the blame for her failures. Why? Eric asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Because someone has to protect the system from idealistic crusades that threaten to destroy everything we've built, Patricia replied, her mask finally slipping completely. Do you have any idea how much money we'd lose if every minority patient who felt dismissed could claim discrimination? How many lawsuits we'd face if we acknowledged that bias influences medical decisions? The casual cruelty in her voice, the reduction of human suffering to financial calculations, made Eric's stomach turn. You've been covering up deaths, Patricia. People have died because you suppressed reports that could have prevented future incidents. People die in hospitals every day, she replied coldly. It's unfortunate, but it's not our responsibility to social engineer the entire healthcare system because some patients feel their feelings were hurt. Dr. Stevens looked up from the catheterization procedure, his face grave. Dr. Monroe, I need you to know that your wife has suffered significant cardiac damage. The blockage was complete, and the delay in treatment has cost her a substantial amount of heart muscle. She's going to survive, but her quality of life may be permanently affected. The words hit Eric like hammer blows. Diana, brilliant, vibrant, unstoppable Diana, might never be the same because Patricia Williams had prioritized institutional reputation over human lives. Patricia, Eric said into the phone, his voice deadly quiet, you're finished. I'm going to personally ensure that you never work in healthcare again. I don't think so, she replied with chilling confidence. Because as of 20 minutes ago, those forged documents have been leaked to every major news outlet in the state. By morning, you'll be the face of systemic bias in healthcare. Your credibility will be destroyed, your authority will be revoked, and I'll be the interim director tasked with cleaning up your mess. The betrayal was complete. Patricia had spent 2 years positioning herself to destroy Eric's career while covering up the very problems he'd been trying to solve. She'd turned his commitment to justice into a weapon against him, ensuring that the man best equipped to fight institutional bias would be eliminated from the battle entirely. You planned this, Eric realized. You've been setting me up from the beginning. I've been protecting an institution that serves thousands of patients every year from being destroyed by political correctness, Patricia corrected. Diana's incident tonight was unfortunate, but it was also an opportunity to neutralize someone whose unrealistic expectations were threatening the entire system. As Eric absorbed the full scope of Patricia's betrayal, he watched Dr. Stevens work to save what remained of his wife's heart function. The woman he loved was fighting for her life because the woman he'd trusted had systematically undermined every effort to prevent exactly this kind of tragedy. The monitors around Diana's bed beeped steadily, marking the rhythm of a heart that would never be quite the same. And in that rhythm, Eric heard the cadence of his own defeat, the realization that fighting institutional bias from within the institution had been impossible from the start. But as he looked at Diana's face, peaceful despite the trauma her body had endured, Eric felt something harder than anger, stronger than despair. He felt the crystalline clarity that came with having nothing left to lose. Patricia Williams had destroyed his career, manipulated his authority, and nearly killed his wife. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed that silencing Eric Monroe would end the fight for justice. She had no idea that Diana Monroe was about to wake up angrier than she'd ever been in her life. And an angry cardiologist with nothing left to lose was far more dangerous than any administrator. The real war was about to begin. Diana awakened to the sound of machines and the sterile smell of cardiac recovery, but it was the expression on Eric's face that told her everything she needed to know. Her husband sat beside her bed at Presbyterian Hospital, his shoulders bowed under a weight that had nothing to do with her medical condition. "How bad?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube that had been removed hours earlier. 40% cardiac function, Eric replied quietly, taking her hand. Significant damage to the anterior wall. Dr. Stevens was able to open the artery, but... Diana closed her eyes, absorbing the implications. 40% meant she'd never practice interventional cardiology again. The precise hand movements, the physical stamina, the split-second decision-making required for cardiac procedures, all of it was beyond her now. Her career, her identity, her sense of purpose had died with those heart muscle cells. "There's more," Eric continued, and something in his tone made Diana's remaining healthy heart tissue clench with dread. He handed her his tablet, the screen displaying a news article with a headline that made her stomach lurch. "Regional Health Director accused of covering up racist medical practices. Wife's heart attack exposes years of discrimination." The article was devastating in its thoroughness. Internal memos bearing Eric's forged signature were reproduced in full, showing explicit instructions to prioritize paying patients and use clinical discretion when treating minorities. Quotes from unnamed hospital staff described Dr. Monroe as demanding and dismissive of bias complaints. Most damaging of all was a statement from Dr. Patricia Williams expressing her shock and disappointment at discovering the extent of her supervisor's discriminatory policies. "She's destroyed you," Diana whispered, scrolling through the article's brutal details. "Patricia has positioned herself as the whistleblower who exposed your corruption." "It gets worse," Eric said, his voice hollow. "The state medical board suspended my license pending investigation. The hospital network has placed me on indefinite administrative leave. And the district attorney is considering criminal charges for negligent homicide in the 2 deaths that occurred under my supposed policies." Diana stared at him in horror. Criminal charges meant prison time, meant the complete destruction of everything Eric had worked to build. The man who had dedicated his life to improving healthcare for underserved communities was being framed as the architect of the discrimination he'd fought against. "We'll fight this," Diana said, struggling to sit up despite the protest from her surgical incisions. "We'll prove Patricia forged those documents. We'll show that you never saw the incident reports." "With what evidence?" Eric interrupted, his despair evident. "Patricia has had 2 years to build this case. Every document trail leads back to my office. Every witness statement supports her version of events. She's turned my own administrative assistant against me. Sarah swears she sent those memos at my direct instruction." Diana felt the walls of their world closing in. Sarah Matthews had worked for Eric for 3 years, had been like family to them. If Patricia had compromised even Sarah's loyalty, then the conspiracy ran deeper than either of them had imagined. "There has to be something," Diana insisted, but even as she spoke, she could see the hopelessness in her husband's eyes. "Dr. Monroe." A new voice interrupted from the doorway. FBI agent Caroline Fletcher stood with her credentials displayed, her expression professionally sympathetic but implacably determined. "I'm sorry to disturb you during your recovery, but we need to speak with both of you about the federal investigation into civil rights violations within the healthcare system." Diana's heart, what remained of it, sank. Federal civil rights violations carried sentences that could destroy lives. The FBI's involvement meant this had escalated far beyond hospital politics into the realm of criminal conspiracy. "Agent Fletcher," Eric said wearily, "I assume you've read the news reports. I want you to know that those documents were forged," Agent Fletcher finished, surprising them both. "We know. Our forensic analysis of the electronic signatures shows clear evidence of manipulation. The question is whether you were complicit in the cover-up or simply a convenient scapegoat." Hope flickered in Diana's chest, but Agent Fletcher's next words extinguished it completely. "However, the evidence suggests that even if you didn't author those specific policies, you were criminally negligent in your oversight duties. Federal law requires healthcare administrators to report patterns of discriminatory care. Your failure to identify and address these issues makes you legally culpable for the resulting deaths." The cruel irony was suffocating. Eric was being prosecuted for failing to uncover a conspiracy specifically designed to keep him ignorant of the problems he would have fought to solve. "Agent Fletcher," Diana said carefully. What would it take to prove my husband's innocence? The FBI agent consulted her notes with the detached professionalism of someone accustomed to destroying lives in service of justice. Concrete evidence that Dr. Monroe was actively working to address bias issues before these incidents came to light. Documentation showing he requested information that was withheld from him. Testimony from credible witnesses confirming his commitment to equal treatment policies. Diana and Eric exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing. Patricia Williams had systematically eliminated exactly that kind of evidence. Any documents that might have exonerated Eric had been destroyed or altered. Any witnesses who might have supported him had been discredited or compromised. There is one possibility, Agent Fletcher continued, her tone suggesting she didn't hold much hope for it. If we could prove that Dr. Williams acted as part of a broader conspiracy to suppress civil rights violations across multiple healthcare systems, it might mitigate Dr. Monroe's liability. But that would require someone with inside knowledge to cooperate with our investigation. What kind of cooperation? Eric asked. Full disclosure of internal communications, access to private documents, testimony against co-conspirators. Essentially, we'd need someone to commit professional suicide in order to expose the truth. Agent Fletcher's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it with a frown. I'm afraid I have more bad news. Dr. Williams has just been appointed as interim regional director, and she's announced a comprehensive reform program to address bias in healthcare. The media is portraying her as the hero who exposed the corruption and is now working to fix it. Diana felt rage building in her chest, her damaged heart working harder as her blood pressure spiked. Patricia Williams wasn't just destroying Eric's career. She was stealing credit for the very reforms that Diana and Eric had wanted to implement. She's going to use our crisis to advance her own agenda, Diana realized. She'll implement cosmetic changes that look good in press releases but don't address the underlying problems. And she'll be celebrated as a reformer while the real issues get buried even deeper. Agent Fletcher nodded grimly. It's a remarkably sophisticated manipulation. Dr. Williams positioned herself to benefit from the crisis she created, while ensuring that the people most capable of exposing her remained discredited. The hospital room fell silent except for the steady beeping of Diana's cardiac monitors. Outside the window, Diana could see news vans gathering in the parking lot, reporters preparing to document the downfall of a once-respected healthcare administrator and his wife. There's something else, Agent Fletcher said quietly. The nurse at Mercy General, Linda Nakamura, has requested to speak with you, Dr. Monroe. She claims to have information that might be relevant to the investigation. Diana's pulse quickened. Linda had been present for Patricia's phone calls, had witnessed the administrative response to the crisis. If anyone had observed something that could expose the conspiracy, it would be someone on the front lines. What kind of information? Eric asked. She won't say, but she's insisting that she'll only speak with you, and only if you agree to meet with her privately. No lawyers, no FBI agents, no recording devices. It was obviously a trap. Linda Nakamura had every reason to lie, to shift blame away from her own actions and onto the administrative failures that had enabled them. Meeting with her privately could be seen as witness tampering, could provide Patricia with additional ammunition to use against them. But it was also their only lead. If I meet with her, Eric said slowly, and she provides information that implicates me further, it could seal my conviction. Yes, Agent Fletcher confirmed. It's an enormous risk. Diana looked at her husband, seeing the impossible choice reflected in his eyes. Trust the woman who had nearly killed her, or accept defeat and let Patricia Williams complete her systematic destruction of everything they'd worked to build. There's something else you should know, Agent Fletcher added reluctantly. Dr. Williams has filed a restraining order against both of you, claiming that you've been harassing her and threatening retaliation. If you're seen near any facility in the hospital network, you'll be arrested. The trap was complete. Patricia had effectively exiled them from the very system they needed access to in order to prove their innocence. Diana was too weak to travel, Eric was facing criminal charges, and their only potential ally was a woman whose testimony could destroy them. Agent Fletcher, Diana said quietly. What happens if we can't prove the conspiracy? What happens to Eric? The FBI agent's expression softened slightly, revealing the human being beneath the professional facade. Best case scenario, he loses his medical license and faces civil liability for the deaths that occurred under his administrative oversight. Worst case, he's convicted of federal civil rights violations and serves 15 to 20 years in prison. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. 20 years would destroy not just Eric's career but their entire future together. Diana would spend whatever remained of her compromised life alone, while the man she loved rotted in prison for crimes he'd never committed. And Dr. Williams, Diana asked, gets to implement her reform program and is probably appointed to a permanent leadership position. She becomes the face of positive change in healthcare, while the real problems she helped create get buried under bureaucracy and public relations. Diana felt something cold and hard settling in her chest, not physical pain this time, but the crystalline clarity that came with accepting an unacceptable reality. The system was rigged, the game was fixed, and playing by the rules meant automatic defeat. But there was another option, one that neither Agent Fletcher nor Patricia Williams had considered. What happened when people with nothing left to lose decided to stop playing the game entirely? Agent Fletcher, Diana said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone in the room. When can we meet with Linda Nakamura? Diana, no, Eric protested. It's too dangerous. If she's working with Patricia, then we'll expose that too, Diana interrupted. Patricia Williams thinks she's won because she's destroyed your reputation and my career. But she's made one crucial mistake. What's that? Agent Fletcher asked. Diana smiled, and there was something in that expression that made both the FBI agent and her husband step back slightly. She thinks this was ever about our careers. But it was never about us. It was about the patients who die because people like Patricia prioritize profit over human life. And dead people don't care about administrative procedures or legal technicalities. The words carried a promise that made Agent Fletcher reach instinctively for her phone, recognizing that Diana Monroe had just crossed a line from victim to something far more dangerous. A woman with a damaged heart and nothing left to lose was about to become Patricia Williams' worst nightmare. The meeting took place in an abandoned wing of Presbyterian Hospital, in a patient room that hadn't been used since the renovation 3 years earlier. Diana sat propped in a wheelchair, her cardiac monitors temporarily disconnected but a portable defibrillator within arm's reach. Eric stood behind her, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder, both of them acutely aware that this conversation could either save or damn them completely. Linda Nakamura entered the room like a woman walking to her own execution. Her nursing uniform had been replaced by civilian clothes, but she still moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to life-and-death decisions. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept since Diana's collapse 2 days earlier. Dr. Monroe, Linda said quietly, addressing Diana directly. Thank you for agreeing to see me. I know you have every reason to. Just tell us what you know, Diana interrupted, her voice carrying none of the warmth from their previous encounter. My heart can't handle much more stress, and my husband is facing 20 years in prison. We don't have time for apologies. Linda flinched but nodded, reaching into her purse to extract a small digital recorder. I've been recording my shifts for the past 6 months, she said, setting the device on the hospital bed between them. It started as protection, malpractice insurance, documentation of protocols. But I captured something the night you came in, Dr. Monroe. Something that changes everything. She pressed play, and Patricia Williams' voice filled the room with chilling clarity. Rebecca, this is Dr. Williams from Regional Administration. I need you to understand that tonight's incident with Mrs. Monroe must be handled very carefully. Dr. Monroe's political agenda has been threatening hospital stability for months, and this situation provides an opportunity to demonstrate the consequences of his unrealistic expectations. Diana's breath caught. Patricia had called Linda that night, had influenced the nurse's response to her medical emergency. The recording continued. I'm instructing you to follow standard protocols exactly as written, regardless of any special requests or claims of medical expertise. Dr. Monroe's wife doesn't get preferential treatment just because of her husband's position. If she has a genuine emergency, it will be apparent through proper triage procedures. But Dr. Williams, she says she's having chest pain. Then she can wait for proper assessment like any other patient. Rebecca, I need you to understand that Dr. Monroe has been filing complaints about bias in our emergency departments. He's trying to create problems where none exist. Tonight's situation will help demonstrate that our protocols work effectively when followed correctly. Eric felt his legs give out, dropping into the chair beside Diana's wheelchair. Patricia had deliberately sabotaged his wife's care, had used Linda as an unwitting weapon in her campaign to destroy his credibility. There's more, Linda said, her voice shaking as she fast-forwarded through the recording. Rebecca, if Mrs. Monroe's condition deteriorates, that's unfortunate but not your responsibility. You followed proper procedures. Any negative outcome will demonstrate the dangers of Dr. Monroe's interference with established protocols. The hospital administration will support you completely. The casual cruelty of Patricia's words, the explicit acceptance that Diana might die as collateral damage in an administrative power struggle, left everyone in the room speechless. She wanted me to fail, Diana whispered, the full scope of Patricia's betrayal finally becoming clear. She wanted me to have a heart attack in your ER so she could blame Eric for the policies that caused it. But that's not the worst part, Linda continued, her hands trembling as she advanced the recording further. After you collapsed, after the ambulance came, she called me again. Patricia's voice returned, now tinged with satisfaction. Perfect outcome, Rebecca. Mrs. Monroe's cardiac event will generate exactly the kind of media attention we need to expose her husband's dangerous policies. When the story breaks tomorrow, make sure you emphasize how you followed standard procedures exactly as Dr. Monroe's office instructed. The documentation will show that his bias complaints created confusion that interfered with proper medical care. Dr. Williams, Mrs. Monroe nearly died. And that tragedy will save countless other patients from the chaos Dr. Monroe's social justice crusade would have created. Sometimes individuals must suffer for the greater good of the healthcare system. Eric stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor as rage threatened to overwhelm his capacity for rational thought. Patricia Williams had not just covered up bias. She had actively orchestrated Diana's near-death experience as a weapon against him. "Why didn't you come forward with this immediately?" he demanded, his voice raw with fury. Rebecca's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her face as she faced the magnitude of her unwitting complicity. "Because I believed her," she sobbed. "Dr. Williams convinced me that you were the problem, that your complaints about bias were political theater that interfered with real medical care. She said your wife was probably faking her symptoms to create a discrimination case, and that following standard protocols would expose the truth. You almost let me die because of politics." Diana's voice was deadly quiet. "I almost let you die because I chose to believe someone who told me what I wanted to hear," Linda corrected, her honesty brutal in its self-condemnation. "Dr. Williams gave me permission to dismiss your pain because it fit my unconscious assumptions about who deserves immediate care. She weaponized my bias and used it to nearly kill you." The room fell silent except for the distant sounds of hospital activity filtering through the walls. Diana stared at the digital recorder, processing the implications of what they'd just heard. "This recording proves Patricia orchestrated the whole thing," Eric said slowly. "It proves she deliberately sabotaged your care to frame me for the consequences." "It proves more than that," Diana replied, her voice growing stronger as the pieces fell into place. "It proves she's been systematically creating the crisis she's now claiming to solve. Every incident, every death, every case of bias that she's now blaming on you, she probably orchestrated all of them." Linda nodded miserably. "She's been calling nurses and residents for months, giving guidance on how to handle difficult cases. Always emphasizing protocol over clinical judgment, always suggesting that patient complaints about discrimination were probably unfounded. Agent Fletcher had been right about needing someone with inside knowledge to expose the conspiracy. But none of them had anticipated that the conspiracy would be this systematic, this calculated, this deliberately lethal. "Rebecca," Diana said carefully, "if you testify about this, if you go public with these recordings, Patricia will destroy your career. She'll claim you're lying to save yourself, that you're shifting blame away from your own negligence." "I know," Linda replied quietly. "My attorney has already explained that cooperating with the FBI investigation will probably cost me my nursing license. The state medical board will say I should have reported Patricia's interference immediately, that my delay makes me complicit in any subsequent harm." Eric looked at the woman who had nearly killed his wife, seeing something he hadn't expected, genuine courage born from devastating self-awareness. "Why are you willing to do this?" he asked. Linda met his eyes directly, no longer flinching from the weight of his judgment. "Because 2 people died from the same manipulation that almost killed your wife. Because there are probably dozens of other cases where Patricia's guidance led to substandard care. And because I have to live with the knowledge that I was her weapon." She stood slowly, the digital recorder still sitting on the hospital bed like evidence of humanity's capacity for both evil and redemption. "But there's something else you need to know," Linda continued. "Patricia didn't work alone. She has allies throughout the hospital network, administrators, department heads, even some physicians who believe that acknowledging bias in healthcare threatens the entire system." "Who?" Diana demanded. "I don't know all of them. But I know they meet regularly, They coordinate responses to discrimination complaints, and they've been planning this campaign against Dr. Monroe for months. They call themselves the Healthcare Preservation Society. The name hit Eric like a physical blow. He'd heard whispers of such a group, informal gatherings of administrators and physicians who believed that social justice initiatives in medicine were political correctness run amok. He'd dismissed them as harmless grumbling, never imagining they'd evolved into an active conspiracy. "Rebecca," Diana said quietly, "testifying against Patricia means testifying against all of them. It means exposing a network of healthcare professionals who've been systematically suppressing evidence of bias. They won't just destroy your career, they'll destroy your life." Linda smiled, and there was something peacefully resolute in her expression. "Dr. Monroe, my life was already destroyed the moment I let you walk out of that emergency room. I've been a nurse for 23 years, and I spent those years believing I treated everyone equally. Learning that I was capable of such bias, that I could be manipulated into nearly killing someone, that knowledge would have destroyed me eventually." She picked up the recorder, holding it like a lifeline. "At least this way, my failure might prevent other failures. At least this way, the patients who died because of Patricia's manipulation might get some justice." Eric felt something shifting in his chest, not the physical sensation of his own damaged heart, but something deeper. For days, he'd been focused on proving his innocence, on restoring his reputation, on salvaging his career. But Rebecca's willingness to sacrifice everything for the truth reminded him why he'd entered medicine in the first place. "If we do this," he said slowly, "if we expose the Healthcare Preservation Society, it won't just destroy individual careers. It'll shake public confidence in the entire medical system. People will question whether they can trust their doctors, whether their pain will be believed, whether their lives have value in the eyes of healthcare providers." "Good," Diana said fiercely. "Maybe they should question those things. Maybe the system needs to be shaken until it remembers that healing requires seeing patients as human beings rather than inconvenient complications." The words hung between them like a challenge to everything they'd believed about working within institutional structures to create change. Diana Monroe, the woman who had spent her career saving hearts, was advocating for breaking the system that had nearly stopped hers. "Agent Fletcher said the FBI needs concrete evidence of conspiracy," Eric said thoughtfully. "Rebecca's recordings are a start, but they'll need more. Documents, communications, evidence of coordination between conspirators." "I can get that," Linda said quietly. "Patricia trusted me enough to include me in some of their communications. I have access to internal documents, meeting schedules, even some of their planning emails." "That's espionage," Eric warned. "If they catch you gathering evidence, you'll face criminal charges on top of everything else." Rebecca's smile was sad but determined. "Dr. Monroe, I've already lost everything that mattered to me. My professional reputation, my self-respect, my belief that I was a good person who helped others. What's left for them to take?" Diana reached out and took Rebecca's hand, the simple gesture bridging the impossible gap between victim and perpetrator. "If we do this together," she said, "we do it all the way. No half measures, no protecting careers, no compromise with people who think some lives matter less than others." It was the moment of transformation that would define everything that followed. Diana Monroe, the cardiologist whose heart had been broken by bias, was choosing to fight not for personal vindication but for systematic justice. Eric Monroe, the administrator whose career had been destroyed by conspiracy, was choosing truth over reputation. And Linda Nakamura, the nurse whose assumptions had nearly killed a patient, was choosing redemption over self-preservation. "There's something else," Linda said quietly. "Patricia scheduled an emergency meeting of the Healthcare Preservation Society for tonight. She's planning to accelerate their timeline, to implement policies that will make bias even harder to detect and report." Diana felt her damaged heart racing, but not from medical distress. From anticipation. "Where?" she asked. "Conference room 12 at Mercy General. 11 p.m., after the shift change when the building will be mostly empty." Eric shook his head immediately. "Diana, you can't. Your heart can't handle that kind of stress, and if we're caught. If we're not there to document what they are planning, people will keep dying," Diana interrupted. "Patricia Williams thinks she's won because she's isolated us, discredited us, turned us into victims. But she doesn't understand what she's actually created." "What's that?" Linda asked. Diana's smile was fierce, predatory, and absolutely terrifying. Three people who have nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The impossible choice had been made. They would risk everything, their freedom, their futures, their lives, for the chance to expose a conspiracy that threatened the foundation of medical ethics. And in making that choice, they discovered something Patricia Williams had never anticipated: that broken people could be infinitely more dangerous than whole ones, because they no longer feared being shattered. The Healthcare Preservation Society was about to learn that their victims had become their hunters. The corridors of Mercy General at 11 p.m. felt like the arteries of a sleeping giant, darkened, quiet, but pulsing with the essential functions that kept life flowing through its halls. Diana moved carefully through the shadows, her portable cardiac monitor muffled but still tracking the irregular rhythm of a heart pushed far beyond its safe limits. Every step was a calculated risk, every breath a negotiation between determination and the reality of her damaged cardiovascular system. Eric walked beside her, one hand steadying her elbow, the other carrying the recording equipment Linda had provided. His medical license might be suspended, but 25 years of hospital navigation had taught him every back corridor, every service elevator, every route that avoided security cameras and curious eyes. "Conference room 12 is just around this corner," Linda whispered, her voice tight with the kind of fear that came from crossing lines that could never be uncrossed. They should already be in session. Diana pressed herself against the wall, feeling the cool institutional paint against her cheek as she tried to calm her racing heart. The cardiac rehabilitation nurses would be horrified to know what she was putting her damaged cardiovascular system through. But some things mattered more than personal medical safety. Through the narrow window in the conference room door, they could see 8 figures seated around the polished table: administrators, department heads, and senior physicians whose faces Diana recognized from medical conferences and hospital board meetings. These weren't rogue employees or isolated bad actors. They were the institutional leadership of the entire regional healthcare network. At the head of the table sat Dr. Patricia Williams, her composed demeanor commanding the room as she outlined plans that would make Diana's stomach turn even if her heart were functioning perfectly. "The Monroe situation has provided us with exactly the opportunity we needed," Patricia was saying, her voice carrying clearly through the door. "Public outrage over bias in healthcare is creating pressure for reforms that would cripple our ability to manage difficult cases efficiently." Dr. Robert Carlson, no relation to Rebecca, but chief of staff at Metropolitan General, leaned forward with obvious interest. "What's the timeline for implementation?" Patricia consulted her tablet with the practiced efficiency of someone who had orchestrated institutional changes before. "The new policies will be in place within 60 days. Enhanced documentation requirements for any patient who claims discriminatory treatment, mandatory consultation with administration before ordering expensive tests for uninsured patients, and standardized protocols that remove clinical discretion from bias-related decisions." Diana felt Eric's hand tighten on her arm as they absorbed the implications. Patricia wasn't just covering up bias. She was systematizing it, creating policies that would make discrimination appear medically justified and legally defensible. "What about the federal investigation?" asked Dr. Maria Santos, Chief of Emergency Medicine at Riverside Medical. "Agent Fletcher is focusing on Dr. Monroe's supposed negligence," Patricia replied with obvious satisfaction. "The forged documents have convinced the FBI that he was either complicit in the cover-up or criminally incompetent in his oversight. Either way, he's neutralized as a threat to our operations." Linda activated the recording device, her hands shaking as she documented the conspiracy that had used her as an unwitting weapon. "And the nurse?" "Dr. Carlson asked. "Linda Nakamura could be a liability if she develops a conscience." Patricia's smile was cold enough to freeze blood. "Linda is facing disciplinary action for her handling of the Monroe case. She's more concerned with saving her own career than exposing administrative policies. Besides, who would believe a nurse who nearly killed a patient claiming that her superiors ordered her to provide substandard care?" The casual dismissal of Rebecca's credibility, the assumption that her working-class status and professional vulnerability made her an acceptable sacrifice, revealed the depth of Patricia's institutional arrogance. "There's something else we need to discuss," Dr. Santos continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The 2 deaths that occurred under the previous protocols. The families are asking questions, hiring attorneys. If they connect those cases to our policy adjustments." "They won't," Patricia interrupted with absolute confidence. "The deaths occurred under Dr. Monroe's administrative oversight. When the criminal charges are filed, those families will see him as the villain who caused their loved ones' deaths. Any civil suits will be directed at him personally, not at institutional policies." Diana pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her heart struggling to process the rage and horror flooding her system. Patricia had orchestrated not just her near-death experience, but the actual deaths of 2 innocent people, then positioned those tragedies as weapons against the man who would have prevented them. The beauty of this approach, Patricia continued, is that it eliminates bias complaints by eliminating the complainers. Patients who feel discriminated against will be too intimidated to speak up, and healthcare providers will have clear protocols that protect them from accusations of prejudice. What about media attention? Asked Dr. James Rodriguez, the interventional cardiologist who should have treated Diana's heart attack. The Monroe case has generated significant coverage about healthcare bias. Patricia's expression turned predatory. Dr. Rodriguez, you raise an important point. The media attention actually serves our purposes perfectly. By tomorrow morning, Dr. Monroe will be arrested on federal civil rights charges. His wife's heart attack will be presented as the tragic consequence of his own discriminatory policies. The narrative will shift from bias in healthcare to corrupt administrator gets comeuppance. The pieces of Patricia's strategy clicked into place with sickening clarity. She hadn't just destroyed Eric and Diana, she'd turned their personal tragedy into propaganda for the very system that had caused it. And after Dr. Monroe is convicted, Dr. Santos asked, "I'll be appointed as permanent regional director," Patricia replied matter-of-factly. "My reform program will be implemented with full federal support, and the Healthcare Preservation Society will have effectively captured the entire regional medical system. We'll be able to operate without interference from social justice activists or bleeding heart administrators who prioritize political correctness over medical efficiency." Dr. Carlson raised his hand like a student seeking clarification. What about future bias complaints? How do we handle patients who claim discriminatory treatment under the new protocols? Patricia's smile was genuinely terrifying in its casual cruelty. Simple. We reclassify bias complaints as patient satisfaction issues and route them through customer service rather than medical administration. No more internal investigations, no more incident reports, no more federal oversight. Just customer service representatives explaining that the patient misunderstood their treatment or had unrealistic expectations. The systematic elimination of accountability mechanisms was breathtaking in its comprehensiveness. Patricia had created a system where discrimination would be not just tolerated but institutionally protected. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patricia said, standing to address the room with the bearing of someone claiming victory. "Within 6 months, we'll have eliminated bias complaints from our healthcare network not by preventing bias, but by preventing complaints. Patients will receive the care we determine is appropriate, and they'll be grateful for whatever attention they receive." That was when Diana Monroe made the decision that would change everything. She stood up. Despite Eric's restraining hand, despite the protest from her damaged heart, despite the career-ending risk of what she was about to do, Dr. Diana Monroe walked through the conference room door and into the middle of the Healthcare Preservation Society's secret meeting. 8 faces turned toward her with expressions of shock, fear, and rage. But it was Patricia Williams' face that held Diana's attention, the momentary mask slip that revealed not just surprise, but terror at being exposed. "Dr. Monroe," Patricia said, her voice carefully controlled despite the obvious panic behind her eyes. "You're trespassing on hospital property. Security has been notified." "No, they haven't," Diana interrupted, placing the recording device on the conference table where everyone could see it. "But the FBI has been. Agent Fletcher is currently in the parking lot with arrest warrants for conspiracy to violate civil rights, fraudulent manipulation of medical records, and negligent homicide." The room erupted in chaos. Dr. Carlson bolted for the door, only to find Eric blocking his exit. Dr. Santos grabbed for her phone, but Linda Nakamura, who had entered behind Diana, was already photographing documents scattered across the conference table. "You have no authority here," Patricia snarled, but her composure was cracking as she realized the scope of the trap closing around her. "You're a disgraced administrator and a patient with heart disease. No one will believe." "They'll believe this," Diana said, holding up her phone. The screen showed a live video feed that had been broadcasting for the past 20 minutes. 12,000 people have been watching your confession in real time. The recording has been automatically uploaded to cloud servers in 17 different locations. Patricia's face went white as she understood the implications. This wasn't just documentation for a federal investigation. It was public exposure that could never be contained or suppressed. "You see, Patricia," Diana continued, her voice growing stronger despite the strain on her cardiovascular system, "you made one crucial mistake. You assumed that destroying our careers would eliminate our ability to fight back. But you forgot that medicine isn't about careers or institutions or administrative hierarchies. She gestured to the live video feed, where the viewer count was climbing past 15,000. It's about healing. And sometimes healing requires cutting out diseased tissue before it spreads to healthy organs. The conference room door burst open as FBI agents flooded in, led by Agent Fletcher with arrest warrants in hand. But the real victory had already occurred, not in the room, but in the thousands of viewers watching the live stream, sharing the video, demanding accountability from their own healthcare providers. Dr. Patricia Williams, Agent Fletcher announced, "You're under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights, fraudulent manipulation of federal healthcare documents, and negligent homicide in the deaths of Graham Johnson and Elena Rodriguez." As handcuffs clicked around Patricia's wrists, she looked at Diana with pure hatred. "You've destroyed the entire healthcare system," she snarled. "Patient confidence, institutional stability, professional relationships, all of it ruined because you couldn't accept that some compromises are necessary." Diana stepped closer, close enough that Patricia could see the determination burning in her eyes despite the exhaustion etched in her face. "I haven't destroyed anything," Diana said quietly. "I've exposed what was already broken. The difference is that now we can fix it." The arrests continued around them. 8 respected healthcare leaders led away in handcuffs while news crews that had been alerted by the viral video stream captured every moment. But Diana's attention was focused on her phone, where the live stream comments revealed something more powerful than any criminal conviction. Viewers were sharing their own stories of bias in healthcare. Patients who had been dismissed, families who had lost loved ones to prejudice disguised as medical judgment, healthcare workers who had witnessed discrimination but felt powerless to report it. "Dr. Monroe," a voice called from the doorway. Linda Nakamura stood there, no longer the terrified nurse who had nearly killed Diana, but a woman transformed by her willingness to face the truth. "The state medical board wants to speak with me about my testimony," Linda said. "They are offering immunity from disciplinary action in exchange for full cooperation with the investigation." Diana nodded, understanding that Rebecca's redemption was just beginning. "What will you tell them?" "The truth," Linda replied simply. "All of it. How bias becomes normalized, how good people can be manipulated into terrible actions, how institutions can corrupt individual judgment while maintaining plausible deniability." As the conference room emptied, Diana finally allowed her exhaustion to show. Her heart was racing, her breathing was labored, and every cardiac monitor would be screaming warnings about the stress she'd subjected her damaged cardiovascular system to. But she had never felt stronger in her life. "How many?" Eric asked, checking the live stream viewer count. 47,000 and climbing, Diana replied. "The video has been shared 1,200 times in the past hour." They looked around the conference room, now empty except for scattered documents and evidence markers placed by FBI agents. This sterile institutional space had been the headquarters of a conspiracy that had killed people and destroyed lives. But it had also become the place where truth finally defeated institutional power. "What happens now?" Eric asked. Diana smiled, and there was something in her expression that suggested this victory was just the beginning of a much larger battle. "Now we heal," she said. "Not just ourselves, but the entire system. Because bias in healthcare isn't a policy problem, it's a human problem. And human problems require human solutions." The live stream was still running, still broadcasting to an audience that had grown to include healthcare workers, patients, families, and advocates across the country. Diana Monroe had become something she'd never intended to be, the face of a movement that would transform how America thought about medical care and human dignity. But first, she needed to get back to her hospital bed before her damaged heart gave out completely. Some victories were worth dying for. This one was worth living for. The real healing was about to begin. 6 months later, Diana Monroe stood at the podium of the National Medical Association's annual conference, her portable cardiac monitor discreetly hidden beneath her blazer, her voice carrying to an audience of 3,000 healthcare professionals who had gathered to hear the woman who had changed everything. "When I walked into Mercy General's emergency room that night," she began, her words echoing the opening moments of a crisis that had transformed an entire industry, "I thought I was just another patient seeking help. I had no idea I was walking into a system that had been systematically trained to see my pain as less important than someone else's." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word from the cardiologist who had become the reluctant face of healthcare reform. Behind her on the massive screen, statistics scrolled past, data that told the story of transformation sparked by one night's confrontation with institutional bias. Mercy General Hospital had implemented the most comprehensive anti-bias training program in the country. 17 administrators across the regional network had been terminated or criminally prosecuted. The Healthcare Preservation Society had been exposed as a conspiracy that extended to 43 hospitals in 12 states, leading to the largest civil rights investigation in medical history. But the real victory wasn't measured in prosecutions or policy changes, it was measured in lives saved. The Monroe Protocols, as they'd become known, had been adopted by over 300 hospitals nationwide. Emergency departments now used blind assessment techniques, real-time bias monitoring, and patient advocacy systems designed to catch discrimination before it could affect care. Most importantly, patients who felt dismissed or discriminated against now had immediate access to independent review processes that couldn't be suppressed by administrative hierarchy. The night I collapsed in that parking lot, Diana continued, her hand unconsciously moving to her chest where her defibrillator lay ready beneath her skin. My heart stopped working the way it was supposed to. But something else started working that had been broken for years. The recognition that healing requires seeing each patient as fully human, fully deserving of care, fully worthy of our best efforts. In the audience, she could see Eric sitting in the front row, his eyes bright with pride and love. His criminal charges had been dropped when Patricia Williams pled guilty to conspiracy and fraud, but the damage to his administrative career had been irreversible. He'd chosen not to fight for reinstatement, instead accepting a position as Director of Healthcare Equity for the Department of Health and Human Services, a role that let him implement bias prevention policies on a national scale. Next to him sat Linda Nakamura, wearing the credentials of a patient safety advocate, a new position created specifically to give former clinical staff a voice in preventing the kind of systemic failures that had nearly killed Diana. Rebecca's nursing license had been suspended for 6 months, but her testimony against the Healthcare Preservation Society had saved her career and transformed her into one of the most effective bias prevention specialists in the country. "I want to share something with you," Diana said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had stared death in the face and emerged with unshakable purpose. Last week, a young Hispanic woman named Maria Santos, not related to the doctor who was arrested, but sharing her name, came to Mercy General's emergency room with chest pain. She was 28 years old, uninsured, and spoke limited English. The audience leaned forward, recognizing the echo of Diana's own experience. Under the old system, Maria would have been dismissed, told to wait, asked to fill out paperwork while her heart muscle died. But under the Monroe Protocols, she was assessed immediately by a nurse trained to recognize bias, treated by a physician who understood that heart attacks don't discriminate by age or income, and received the same cardiac catheterization that saved her life. Diana paused, letting the success story settle into the minds of healthcare providers who had spent careers unconsciously replicating the failures of institutional bias. Maria Santos is alive today because Linda Nakamura learned to see her own assumptions, because Eric Monroe fought to change systems instead of just treating symptoms, and because thousands of healthcare workers like you decided that patient dignity matters more than administrative convenience. In the back of the auditorium, Diana could see news cameras capturing her speech for the evening broadcasts that had made healthcare bias a national conversation. The viral video of Patricia Williams' confession had been viewed over 12 million times, sparking congressional hearings and federal legislation that would reshape medical education and hospital accountability. But the most important changes weren't happening in Washington or in boardrooms. They were happening in examination rooms and emergency departments where healthcare workers were learning to see patients as human beings first, medical cases second. "I'm often asked whether I'm angry about what happened to me," Diana continued, her voice growing softer but somehow more powerful. "Whether I resent the nurse who dismissed me, the system that failed me, the woman who orchestrated my near-death experience for political gain." She looked directly at Rebecca, seeing the woman who had become not just a colleague but a friend, someone whose willingness to face her own failures had enabled systematic healing. The answer is no. I'm not angry, because anger focuses on the past, and healing requires focusing on the future. The question isn't why bias exists in healthcare, it's how we transform it into compassion. Diana's cardiac monitor was registering an elevated heart rate, but not from medical distress. From anticipation, from hope, from the knowledge that her damaged heart was pumping blood through a body that had become a vehicle for change rather than just a collection of failing organs. 3 years ago, I thought my purpose was performing cardiac catheterizations, opening blocked arteries, repairing damaged hearts. I was good at that work, and I thought it was enough. Her voice caught slightly as she acknowledged the career that had been lost when her heart function declined to 40%. But I learned something in that parking lot as my heart stopped beating. I learned that sometimes our greatest failures become our most important successes. Sometimes losing what we think we need helps us find what the world actually needs. Behind her, the presentation screen showed photos of the Diana Monroe Institute for Healthcare Equity, a research and training center that had grown from a personal tragedy into a national resource for bias prevention in medical care. The work we do now, training healthcare providers to recognize unconscious bias, developing protocols that protect vulnerable patients, creating accountability systems that prevent cover-ups. This work saves more lives than I ever could have saved in a cardiac catheterization lab. Diana looked out at the audience, seeing faces that reflected every demographic, every specialty, every level of medical training. But she also saw something that gave her hope, recognition, understanding, and commitment to do better. Ladies and gentlemen, bias in healthcare isn't someone else's problem. It's not limited to certain hospitals or certain regions or certain types of providers. It's a human problem that requires human solutions. Solutions that start with each of us acknowledging our capacity for prejudice and committing to overcome it. She stepped closer to the microphone, her final words carrying the weight of transformation earned through suffering. When you go back to your hospitals, your clinics, your emergency departments, I want you to remember Maria Santos. I want you to remember that every patient who walks through your doors carries the full complexity of human experience, dreams, fears, families, dignity. And I want you to remember that your assumptions about who deserves care and who can wait might be the difference between life and death. The standing ovation lasted 8 minutes, but Diana barely heard it. Her attention was focused on Eric's face, seeing in his expression the same love and partnership that had sustained them through the darkest months of their lives. As she left the podium, Linda Nakamura was waiting in the wings with Diana's medication and a fresh battery pack for her cardiac monitor. The woman who had once dismissed Diana's pain had become her closest protector, her most trusted colleague, her living reminder that redemption was always possible. "How do you feel?" Linda asked, checking Diana's heart rate and blood pressure with the skill of someone who had learned to see medical data as human stories rather than clinical abstractions. "Like my heart is working exactly the way it's supposed to," Diana replied, and both women understood she wasn't talking about cardiac function. In the audience, Eric Monroe watched his wife embrace the woman who had nearly killed her, seeing in that gesture the essence of everything they had fought to achieve. Justice that healed rather than punished. Change that transformed rather than destroyed. Love that created rather than consumed. His phone buzzed with a text message from Agent Fletcher. Patricia Williams sentenced to 15 years federal prison. Healthcare Preservation Society investigation expanding to include medical schools and insurance companies. Your work is changing everything. But Eric's attention was focused on his wife, on the woman whose damaged heart had become the foundation for systematic healing that would prevent countless other families from experiencing their trauma. As they walked out of the conference center together, Diana leaning slightly on Eric's arm but walking with the confident stride of someone who had found her true purpose, they passed a young medical student who had been recording Diana's speech on her phone. "Dr. Monroe," the student called out, "what would you tell healthcare workers who are afraid to report bias they've witnessed, who worry about retaliation or career damage?" Diana paused, considering the question that went to the heart of institutional change. "I'd tell them that their careers will survive, but their patients might not. I'd tell them that the temporary discomfort of speaking truth is nothing compared to the permanent damage of staying silent. And I'd tell them that courage is contagious. When one person stands up, others find the strength to stand with them." As they reached their car, Eric helped Diana into the passenger seat, his hands gentle on her arms as he made sure her cardiac monitor was positioned properly. The small gestures of care had become second nature, expressions of love that acknowledged her physical limitations while celebrating her unlimited capacity for creating change. "Where to next?" he asked, starting the engine. Diana looked at her schedule on her phone, seeing a week filled with hospital consultations, bias prevention training sessions, and meetings with legislators who were still crafting laws to prevent future Patricia Williams from weaponizing healthcare administration. "Home first," she said, smiling at the man who had fought beside her through the darkest months of their lives. "Then we change the world. One hospital at a time, one healthcare worker at a time, one patient at a time." As they drove through the city, past billboards advertising the Monroe protocols and radio ads promoting bias awareness in healthcare, Diana felt something she hadn't experienced since her heart attack: complete peace with her purpose. Her cardiac catheterization days were over, but her life-saving work had just begun. And unlike the temporary fixes she'd provided in the cath lab, the changes she was creating now would prevent heart attacks, save lives, and heal a healthcare system that had been sick with prejudice for far too long. The woman who had once fixed individual hearts was now healing the heart of medicine itself. And that was exactly where her damaged heart was meant to be. What did this story teach you about the power of turning personal tragedy into systematic change? Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that will change how you see the world.